Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Craddock. I'm a director of Eton Bridge, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. I think we've got well over 500 people joining us today, so thank you for dialing in. I hope you can see and hear me okay. Always have fun and games with the internet, don't we? For those of you who don't know Eton Bridge, we are an executive search, interim management and consulting business supporting our clients who are startups, SMEs and global blue chips with their hiring needs right across the breadth of corporate leadership. Geographically, we support clients in the UK, Europe, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and increasingly globally. We're nearly at 100 people, having started the business in 2010, and we're currently moving to bigger offices in both Windsor and London. So we are growing and expanding, and we thank all of our candidates and clients for their ongoing support. Whilst we are growing, we'll never forget what's made us successful, which really is our ongoing focus on relationships and delivery. We've had a very strong start to the year. We're ahead of budget, I'm pleased to say. There's demand out there from clients across a range of sectors and geographies as they grow and transform their businesses. You don't want to hear too much from me, I'm sure. You've really dialed in to hear from our special guest speaker today, who's spoken to many of you before on behalf of Eton Bridge. So thank you for coming back again, David. David is obviously the economics editor of the Sunday Times. So I'll hand over to David for his presentation, which will be about half an hour. And then there will be questions that I put to him. So please do submit questions in the chat box. And I'll put as many of those questions to David as I can in the hour that we have, and we'll finish promptly at 2 p.m. So David, lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us, and I'll hand over to you for your presentation.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'll just, if I can, bring up my presentation, and we'll take it from there. So, an interesting time. It's obviously a slightly concerning time. We've got a new uncertainty. It's one thing after the other. We've got the Russian invasion of Ukraine coming just as we thought we were getting to the sunlit uplands post-pandemic. And of course, preceding that, we've had a lot of interesting events and shocks to deal with. So what I want to talk about today is what's the outlook amid this new uncertainty? What does Russia-Ukraine mean for us? But not just that, what are the prospects for the economy? So I've set myself 4 questions. As I always say, it's easier to answer questions that you set yourself, and I'm sure you've got tougher ones for me. So first one is, can the recovery continue both here and globally in the face of these headwinds, including now the Russia-Ukraine situation? Inflation, cost of living crisis, big issue of the moment. Is that going to continue? Is it a blip, or is it going to be long lasting? Bank of England, as some of you will know, we've just had an announcement from the Bank of England of a rise in interest rates from 0.5% to 0.75%. Are there going to be many more, and what will the impact of that be? And looking forward to the spring statement, have we seen all the tax hikes that Rishi Sunak intends? Will he announce some cuts, or is he saving those for later? Will he announce other help for the economy? So, the spring statement is next Wednesday. It has become, I suppose, a more important event than it looked like being a few weeks ago. So I'll talk about that towards the end. And there are other issues, supply shortages, labor shortages. I mean, and nobody, least of all the Chancellor, expected that on the way out of the pandemic, we'd be faced with labor shortages. The furlough scheme was intended to prevent unemployment from rising too much. Instead, we've got labor shortages. That's interesting. Leveling up, what does that mean? Net zero, a bit of a political campaign is starting on trying to wind back net zero. Business rates, any prospect of meaningful and lasting reform on there? And this issue that came up a few months ago, where Prime Minister claimed that he wanted a high wage economy, and he kind of forgot to say that you needed a high productivity economy to achieve that. So that's another issue. But on the first question, just a few weeks ago in January, these are the IMF's global economic forecasts, which, as you can see, are pretty strong. I mean, 2022 was never going to be as strong as 2021 in terms of economic growth, because that 2021 was the big bounce back year for everybody. But these were good, strong economic growth prospects for the world. And wherever you look, there was going to be pretty strong economic growth. On this particular vintage of forecasts in January, you can see, and the government was quick to point this out, that the UK was heading for the strongest growth in the G7, having had that in 2021. So this was an upbeat forecast as far as the UK was concerned. The bigger picture was that America is receiving a kind of post-pandemic fiscal boost through the various stimulus packages that the Biden presidency has introduced. China still suffering difficulties and intense difficulties. I don't know how many of you look at the numbers on COVID globally, but there is a particularly serious outbreak happening in Hong Kong at the moment, and China has introduced new lockdowns in response to COVID there. There is a debate about whether the Chinese vaccine works as effectively as some of those we have in the West. So I think China was very recently a 10% growth economy. It's grown by 9.5% a year on average since the late 70s. But now 5% looks tough for it to achieve. And everybody was confidently predicting that China would overtake America as the world's biggest economy before the end of this decade. That may now not happen, given the fact that China has slowed perhaps a bit more than was expected. But then on top of those, after those relatively optimistic January forecasts, we've had the Russian invasion, we've had Putin, and the latest assessment. This is the IMF managing director just last week, suggesting that first and foremost, this is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, but also that the next time the IMF and others revisit their global forecast, they will revise them down, and that's which is inevitably going to be the case. So the global economy was expected to be very strong in 2022. It's still expected to grow, but perhaps at a more measured pace, a lower pace than was previously expected. So Russia-Ukraine is important in that respect because of this new energy shock that we are now living through. If we look at the UK economy, then it's quite interesting that we are now, as of January, the latest figures we have of January, just above where we were pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic was February 2020. The economy is now slightly bigger than it was then. And I think that just illustrates the unusual nature of this recession and recovery, in the sense that it was not driven by normal economic events. It was driven by a public health crisis and the government's response to it, i.e. the lockdowns. And you can see on there the really sharp downturn in the spring of 2020. The economy, a bad quarter for the UK economy in normal times would be a 2% quarterly decline in GDP. The biggest on record before this in the post-war period was in the 3-day week of 1974, when GDP fell by 2.7% in that quarter. But in the second quarter of 2020, it fell by almost 20%, which just showed the impact of lockdowns, the impact of behavioral changes, but also the fact we've got back to where we were before the pandemic struck is quite unusually quick. Normally it takes 3 years to get back to pre-pandemic levels of GDP, of activity. After the financial crisis, it took 5 years. So to be back where we are, we've missed 2 years of economic growth. It's been a roller coaster, but it's quite a speedy return to where we were, and that's good news. If we look at across where we are now, business confidence is better than it was a couple of months ago. In December, when the Omicron variant hit, businesses got very, very downbeat about that because it was combined with cost pressures, intensifying cost pressures. And as you can see, it's picked up a bit from that low point, but it's not as strong as it was for parts of last year when, on the back of the vaccine rollout, the UK economy was growing really very strongly. So business confidence is still a little bit fragile if we look at that. But February, before the invasion, the economy was doing very well indeed. This is the Purchasing Managers Index, PMI, the way to interpret these indices is very simple. When they're above 50, they show growth. When they're below 50, where there's no growth, we're in recession. And you can see the extent of the downturn as a result of the pandemic, but also the fact that things were pretty healthy last month before the pandemic struck. Healthy in services reopening after Omicron, but also healthy in manufacturing. So this was a strong picture for the economy, for where we were. Consumers, though, are a little bit downbeat at the moment. I mean, this latest consumer confidence reading, this barometer, is actually lower than it was in January 2021. And you know how bleak things looked there. I think a lot of people thought that that third lockdown was the worst of the lot because it was in winter and so on. We didn't know how quickly we would be able to come out of that. But people are pretty downbeat now. And instead of this being this is no longer a COVID phenomenon, it's a cost of living phenomenon. And you can see, I suppose, why that is. This is the Bank of England's assessment of what will be happening to real incomes, to after tax, after inflation incomes over the next few months. And I have to tell you that in today's assessment, as it made the interest rate announcement, the bank is even gloomier about this. Before it's expected a single peak in inflation of about 7% or so in April. Now it expects it to be higher than that, but also for there to be a second peak later in the year in around October, November. So real incomes are being squeezed quite aggressively at the moment. This is the cost of living crisis, set out in economists' language. But against that, given that we're facing a fall in real incomes, given that wages and salaries in general, some people will be achieving wages and salaries of more than the average, but the average earnings are rising by around about 4% compared with inflation, which is already 5.5%, is set to go above 8% in a few weeks' time. This is a real income squeeze. So you have to ask the question, why in those circumstances will people keep spending? Well, this is one of the reasons, that the labor market is still very strong. The readings that we get from surveys of employment intentions among firms are still very buoyant, and some of those, the Bank of England, tried to assess whether Russia-Ukraine has changed any of that, and the answer to that from its own regional agents was no. So things are still pretty buoyant there. Firms still intend to recruit. A bigger problem for most businesses is whether you can get hold of people, not whether you want to get hold of people. So labor shortages are still a more serious problem than whether you want to recruit or not. So that's a strong thing. That buoys up people's willingness to spend. So does the fact that there are lots of vacancies in the economy. Now, some of this is because the nature of job vacancies has changed. I'm still very nostalgic, as you might expect, for the days when Sunday Times used to run vast appointment sections, sometimes 24 pages, sometimes 28 or 36 pages of job appointments, executive appointments. We don't have those now because, quite sensibly, people have migrated to the internet and to other forms of job placement and job search, including, of course, the kind of thing that Eton Bridge does. So I miss those, and it's easier to post job vacancies now because it's possible to do it online. But even so, this is extraordinarily strong. There are roughly as many job vacancies in the economy as there are unemployed people, which never really happens. The ratio 1-to-1 unemployed people to vacancies shows that the tightness of the labour market. It's rarely that tight. So thinking about this, there are jobs there. People have also got the build-up of so-called involuntary savings from the period of the pandemic. That long period where we couldn't spend on the things we normally spend on, like foreign holidays, like going out, like entertainment, eating out, entertainment, all those things. So those have created a kind of 200 billion fund of involuntary savings, which again, people may dip into, and probably will dip into, to see themselves through this cost of living crisis. You know, they're not evenly spread, those savings. You know, some people have got them, some people haven't, but it provides something of a kind of bulwark against the bulwark against the squeeze on real incomes. And for that reason, you know, I think we should expect economic growth this year. It's probably not going to be as strong as it was. I mean, in January, the IMF thought we would grow by 4.7%. I'd be looking for a growth number of closer to 3% this year. This is one of the Bank of England's famous fan charts, which I always say about these. You know, it's a great way of presenting forecasts because you can never be entirely wrong. But the bold green bit in the middle is where they expect the economy to go, which is, you know, okay, essentially for this year, slowing a little bit more next year as we get back to normal, but pretty good growth. And I think I say, you know, 3% growth, if we achieve that, and there's every reason to think we can, is still pretty good. So I think the recovery has been a bit damaged by Russia, Ukraine, along with all these other events, along with the cost of living crisis, but it's still there. I don't think we're going to, you know, some people are already starting to talk about, you know, start talking about using the R word and talking about recession. I don't think that. I think it's premature to think that. Something worse would have to happen to give us a recession, I think. So I think we've got growth, and growth should continue for this year. What about COVID? I think the only thing about COVID I would mention is you know, the assumption is that we've seen the back of it. There's just this slight worry. I mentioned Hong Kong, which, you know, where cases have gone up spectacularly. In the UK, cases are going up. You see that bit I've highlighted on the right-hand side here at the end. But I think and what this is at the moment is a kind of a mutation, a variant of Omicron, which is not thought to be any more dangerous than Omicron. Of course, Omicron, we had lots of cases of Omicron, but far fewer hospitalizations and deaths than in the previous variant. So we just have to hope that continues to be the case. So I think the growth outlook is still positive, not as positive as it was at the start of the year, but you know, we shouldn't talk ourselves into something gloomier than is necessary. What about inflation? You know, I mentioned that inflation is already 5.5% and set to go higher, and you know, we're now talking about kind of comparisons with previous eras. You know, if it goes to 8%, then that is the highest since the early 90s. It's, you know, I still don't think we're, you know, the comparisons with the really high inflation of the past, you know, 20% plus and so on are appropriate. I don't think we're going there. Things have changed. And I think there are reasons to think that despite Russia, Ukraine, some of this will be temporary. And this, you know, it's important to recognize that this is a global thing. You know, many countries, pretty well every country, is experiencing high inflation. America's got the highest inflation rate. It's nearly 8% there already for 40 years. So this is not just us. You know, we tend to look at these things on a local basis, but everybody's suffering from the reopening of the economy after pandemic, the supply shortages, the rise in energy prices, exacerbated, of course, by the situation in Ukraine. And looking at this, you know, this just picks up on what is likely to happen now, which is the idea that there will now be two peaks for inflation this year before it starts to fall. Previously, it looked as though it was going to be, you know, a peak in April, May, then falling quite sharply and getting back to kind of 2 or 3% quite quickly, because of the Russia, Ukraine, because of the likely effect that will have on the energy price cap in October. The energy price cap is very interesting. I don't know how many of you have received your energy price, you know, kind of announcements through email recently, and I suspect many of you're going to face a bill rather higher than the energy price cap, which is based on a typical home. I don't know what a typical home is, but the energy price cap is likely to go up again in October, given what's already happened to gas prices. So that means we get, you know, 8% inflation this spring, 8% or so again in October before it starts to fall. But we have to hope it does fall. And I think there are there are reasons to think it might do. Business costs and prices again rising fast. Raw material costs going up, fuel costs obviously going up very sharply. That was starting to ease off a little bit in the latest figures, but I think Russia-Ukraine will have given this another lurch. It's the kind of thing where it's the kind of thing we could have done without. I mean, people in Ukraine could obviously do without this desperately, but also just as we were emerging from some of those supply shortages and from some of those higher energy prices due to reopening, then Russia-Ukraine gives us another leg up in terms of the supply chain problems and energy price problems. And house prices, of course. One of the most extraordinary things about the pandemic years has been what happened to the housing market. Normal circumstances, the kind of fall in the economy we saw in the spring of 2020 would normally be associated with a house price crash, instead of which the housing market paused for breath very briefly before embarking on this prolonged rise. And we've still got, despite the fact that interest rates are going up, despite the end of the stamp duty holiday last September, we've still got double-figure house price inflation, which is pretty extraordinary. Wages, pay growth, as I say, is 4%, lagging behind in general. I mean, I don't encourage anybody to be unnecessarily on the move, but there is a big difference between pay rises for people who stay in the same job, running at around about 3, 4, 5%, and people who change jobs, who get the average there for job changes is sort of 9 to 10%. So I'm not encouraging anybody to be on the move unnecessarily, but it is a fact. I suppose it's always been a fact that if you change, the best way of getting a pay rise is to change jobs, or even to threaten to change jobs. What's going to happen to inflation? I think it's the Bank of England obviously hopes desperately that it will come down, and it's going to celebrate its 25th anniversary of independence with inflation at 8% when it should be 2%. But I think there are good reasons why it should come down. Energy price, we call them spikes for a reason, because they tend not to last. We've had them before. We had an oil price spike in 2008, another one in 2011, and then they fell away. So I think even despite Russia-Ukraine, this is not likely to be as long-lasting as people fear. And you may have noticed that already the oil price has come down to around about $100 a barrel from touching 130, 140 not so long ago. So they do spike and then they come back again. The supply chain difficulties, the issue there, I think, is not so much Russia-Ukraine, but what's happening in China. If the Chinese lockdowns are the biggest risk there, if there are further lockdowns, if the Chinese ports get clogged up even more, then those supply chain difficulties might start to come back again. But I think markets are pretty good at adjusting and adapting and finding new sources of supply. So I'm reasonably optimistic that will start to, the easing of that will start to show through more obviously in coming months. We won't get a wage price spiral. The economy and the labour market is very different from what it was in the past, and that's why wage growth is 4% rather than 10% on average at the moment. And also, a lot of people would say, well, the reason we've got high inflation is because the Bank of England did so much quantitative easing, QE, in response to the pandemic, which it did. But it has started to rein that back now. The QE has been replaced by QT, quantitative tightening, and already that's taken about 30 billion off the amount that the Bank of England pumped into the economy through quantitative easing. So that again will tend to push down on inflation. So I think it's a longer blip than we wanted. It's not going to be over by it's not just going to be this spring. We'll see a second one in the autumn, a second peak in the autumn. But after that, I think it's reasonable to think inflation will come back down. It's not going to be, not going to be the kind of inflation that was such a horror story in the past. What about interest rates? To say quoting or misquoting Sherlock Holmes, this particular dog, the interest rate dog, hasn't barked all that much in recent years. We've been used to very stable interest rates. This is a real dog, by the way, and he wasn't barking very much that day. He couldn't get him to do anything. But the fact that we haven't seen many rises in interest rates, and stable interest rates have been the norm. That's been very different recently. You'll notice this rather impressive chart which takes in today's interest rate rise. I anticipated it. I haven't been quickly on the into the charts since 12 o'clock. I anticipated that the bank rate would go up by a quarter of a point to 0.75% today. It's not enormously high. It's where it was before the pandemic. But the pre-pandemic level was actually, the highest level we'd had since the financial crisis. Before the financial crisis, bank rate had never been below 2%. Since the financial crisis, it's never been above 0.75%. So this is, we're just about to enter interesting territory, I think, in terms of interest rates. So we can expect further increases. The Bank of England talked about that today, further modest increases. So I don't think they're going to, the unusual thing about recent moves in interest rates is that we've had 3 in a row in terms of successive meetings of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. And that hasn't happened since just after it was first given independence in 1997. So there's a certain urgency to what it's been doing and in raising rates. I think it's going to go further. So we'll go up, maybe 1.25%, 1.5%, maybe to 2% next year. But I still don't think we're breaking out of the kind of low interest rate story that we've had for more than a decade now. Only if the Bank of England thinks that nobody is taking it seriously anymore, that inflation expectations have suddenly shot up. People expect inflation over the long term to be, nearer to 10% than 2%, then only if that happens would we see interest rates break out of the kind of range we've seen. So, 5% was the norm before the financial crisis, 12% was the average in the 1980s. I don't think we're heading back to either of those levels, but 2%, maybe a little bit more, is the kind of rate one should expect for official interest rates. Of course, interest rates in the economy tend to be higher than that unless you're a saver. Borrowing rates are higher than that. But that's the kind of thing I think one should expect on rates. What about Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor? He has astonishingly only been Chancellor for a couple of years. He's already made 18 fiscal announcements in that time. So he's been a very active Chancellor, and next week we will see him in action again. It's worth remembering that, what we saw from him last year in terms of announcements, none of these tax increases have yet been implemented, but the announcements were many and varied, including most dramatically the rise in corporation tax from 19 to 25% to take effect next year, income tax allowances and thresholds to be frozen from next month. And of course, when that was announced in March last year, the Treasury's expectation was the inflation would be quite low at that point, 2 or 3%. To do that at a time of 8% inflation is a much bigger squeeze than was anticipated then. And the national insurance increase, going up from it says April next year, it's April this year, sorry on that. That's a mistake on the chart. So it's from next month. So 1.25 points on employer and employee national insurance. And this was a big series of announcements, 40 billion annual tax hike, if all of those are fully implemented, which is a question of the moment, really, given the circumstances we're in. He wants to keep debt under control. He wants to, he's never going to reduce debt in cash terms, but he wants to ensure that it stabilizes relative to GDP, relative to national income. That's his ambition. He also wants to leave room for tax cuts. Now we're not that far from the end of this parliament, given that this parliament can only last till 2024, and we're in March 2022 now. But I think this was a nod to the Conservative backbenchers that his instincts are as a tax cutter rather than a tax hiker, and so he wants to leave room for tax cuts. which makes the spring statement next week rather interesting, because the context of this is that the tax burden is the taxes as a percentage of GDP is scheduled to rise to the highest since Clement Attlee was Prime Minister in the early 1950s, and that's not a label he wants to be left with, I don't think, as Chancellor. And a lot of people say to me, well, how can that be? I can remember 83% tax in the income tax in the 1970s, top rate there. Corporation tax, even though it's going up to 25%, used to be a lot higher than it is. But of course, many other taxes have gone up, many reliefs have gone. VAT has gone up a lot, national insurance has gone up a lot, and is intended to go up more. So the tax, and recent chancellors have been, past masters at stealth taxation. So there's a lot of things, when we had 83% income tax in the 1970s, you could offset pretty much everything against tax. The number of reliefs was enormous. So anybody actually paying 83% wasn't getting good advice. It's rather different now. So what's going to happen next week on March 23rd? I mean, the main reason for having this spring statement was always intended to be that, under it is a legal requirement that we have 2 new economic forecasts a year. A legal requirement dating back to the mid-70s. And so we have to have a new economic forecast, new official forecast from the Office of Budget Responsibility. And there are pluses and minuses here. I mean, the big plus as far as the Chancellor is concerned is that the budget deficit will be quite a bit lower than it was expecting even a few weeks ago, even in late October. But of course, alongside that, inflation is going to be much higher than expected. They only expected a peak of 5%. It's now going to be 8% or so. But growth isn't going to be as strong as it expected back in October. In October, it expected 6% growth and extraordinarily strong business investment and consumer spending. I think both of those are going to be weaker than it expected then. It will still predict growth, as I was suggesting earlier, but somewhat weaker growth than it was expecting in October last year. So what's going to happen from the Chancellor now? There's a real battle going on, a battle for public opinion and so on. The Treasury thinks that what it did last month in terms of the £150 council tax reduction for bands A to D homes, the other package which will reduce energy bills by £200 in October, paid back over the following 5 years. They had thought that would be enough until Russia-Ukraine. A lot of pressure on for abandoning the national insurance hike, which wouldn't be a bad thing to do, because the national insurance hike is intended to fold into a new tax called the Health and Social Care Levy, to take effect in April 2023. Well, you could skip the interim NI hike and just introduce the Health and Social Care Levy in April 2023, delay rather than cancel it. Pensions, the triple lock and state pensions, the increase in benefits, 3.1% at a time of 8% inflation looks pretty mean. Now, Ireland has just announced bigger cuts in duty on petrol and diesel. I think the Treasury will resist that quite strongly, but a lot of Tory backbench pressure. And the answer to this, I think any of those things are possible, and you will know more. I urge you to read the Sunday Times on Sunday. I always urge you to read that. But my colleagues and myself, we'll be briefed on what is going to happen. The Treasurer was warned. He was warned off leaking the contents of his budgets last by the Treasury, the Committee of MPs, the Commons Committee, the Commons Treasury Committee a few weeks ago. But I don't think that will stop them. But I think the big picture is that after all those tax announcements that we saw last year, I think that was it in terms of tax hikes. The pressure is to go in the opposite direction. And so I think we've seen all the tax hikes. We're going to see the onus now will be on cuts. And it's a question of whether he cuts now or later. A lot of pressure to cut something now and to provide more support for the economy next week. So we'll see. It's a bit up in the air at the moment. I can't give you 100% answers on what he will do, but I think it's going to be a bigger statement than the Treasury first intended. And I'll just update you finally with my skip index. I may have told some of you before that there are two. The skip index I've been monitoring for years and years, decades in fact. And but for the pandemic period, I also introduced a new measure, a new informal economic indicator, which was the station car park indicator. About a half mile from where I live, there's a station car park which takes people into central London. Starting with the skip index, the way it works is when there are none at all, there's no growth, or we're in recession. When there are two, we're growing in line with what economists have called trend growth. And when there are four, it's an unsustainable boom. And I can tell you there have been times during the pandemic when we've had none at all, and we've had four or more in the street, people doing loft conversions, improving their home offices and all those things. But now it's settled down at a reasonably neat and reassuring two. Despite Russia, Ukraine, there are still two skips in the street. So that's reassuring. As for the station car park, there are times when it was during lockdowns when it was 10% full. This is a station car park normally full to bursting. At times when it was 10% full, at times when it got back, to 20 or 30% full. It's now, I would say, about 60, 70, maybe 75% full on most days. So not back to normal. Fewer people are commuting, many more people working from home, but better than it was. So another potential sign of the economy picking up and getting back to some kind of normality. And of course, the new normality may mean more working from home than before. But anyway, thank you for listening. I'll stop the presentation there, and very happy to take any of your questions. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Hi, David. Can you hear me?
I can. Yes, I can't see you, Mark, but I can hear you.
Oh, I think I'm just going to come on screen now. There we go. Thank you as always for a fascinating talk and overview, and as always, love the skip index. That's always a reassuring one. We've had lots and lots of questions come through on the chat box, so I'll get through as many as I can. We've got 21 minutes, I think. First question is from Chris Woodman. He writes, as someone who was a teenager in the 1970s, I've now forgotten the playbook for inflation after so many years of low inflation. What are the top three things we should be focused on running businesses in a high inflation environment?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think we sometimes forget, that inflation was very high in the 70s. I mean, it wasn't just. I mean, putting together a piece on this for this Sunday for the Sunday Times, and it wasn't just the OPEC oil price hike. The build up to the inflation of the 70s was there for some time, and even in early 1971, 2 years before oil prices went up, we had 10% inflation in the UK. We had, the decision by the Labour government, Dennis Healey as Chancellor, to try and expand through the recession caused by the oil price hike had an upward effect on inflation. But in 1975, not only did we have an inflation peak of nearly 27%, but wages and salaries grew by more than 29%. So the wage price spiral was very much alive and well and living in the UK. So I think as businesses, you have to, cost control is always very important. So I think that's a first priority, a bigger priority than normal. A second priority is that, the circumstances in which, wage increases are justified have not really changed. Wage increases should normally be justified by productivity improvements. I don't think that has changed. And I think you should try and encourage people who work for you to see through this. I mean, even though it's going to be two peaks this year in inflation, it's also not going to be around forever. So they shouldn't think that 8% inflation is the norm. They should think of this as a kind of a temporary shock that that we've had and we've suffered from. And if you can persuade them that, I think that is worth doing. I mean, it is still the case, I should say, that formal wage settlements are still pretty low. They're higher than they were, but still around about 3%. And I don't think, employee expectations. I mean, most employees, I think, would be pretty gobsmacked if you suddenly said, right, inflation is going up, I'm going to give you an 8% pay increase. I mean, most people just don't expect that. So I think cost control, having a proper dialogue with the people who work for you, trying to convince them that it's temporary as well. I think that's true. The other issue I think is it's not, we're not going to get to 17%, 12%, 5% bank rate, but also I think the economy and everybody else has got to adjust to a slightly higher level of interest rates than we've been used to over the past 12 years. Even if it's only 2% or so, it's still higher than we've had since the early part of 2009. So that will be an adjustment for some people. Younger people haven't seen that. So again, that's something worth thinking about.
Thanks, David. Another question here from Massimo Petronio. He writes, recently, Professor Antonio Fatas said that statistically low unemployment leads to recessions, especially in the US, due to overheating and imbalances. What is your view?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. I mean, what he is talking about there, Massimo, is the conventional view of recessions. What causes recession? What causes recessions in normal circumstances is that the economy runs at or above capacity, and one measure of that is low unemployment. Policymakers, particularly the central banks, respond by raising interest rates very sharply. And of course, the Federal Reserve has started to raise interest rates now. Its first hike came yesterday. But I don't think we're in that world anymore. I think the drivers of, if there are drivers of recession now, it's the hit to real incomes from sharply rising prices of necessities like energy and food. That's what will do it. But I don't think that this is, because in the UK, if you take the UK, we achieved very low unemployment before the pandemic struck. There was no sign of recession then. We've returned to that low unemployment level, low unemployment rate, 3.9%. One of the things we need to do, and this is true in America as well as in the UK, is draw back in the people who left the labour market as a result of the pandemic. In the case of they called it the Great Resignation in America. Here in the UK, almost 600,000 people of age 50 plus have dropped out of the labour market, dropped out of the workforce since the start of the pandemic. Most of them haven't done so because of ill health. They've done so, they decided to take early retirement or something, but those people were working beforehand. And so you can expand the available capacity of the labour market if you bring people back into it. It's a bigger problem. Participation is a big problem in America than it is here, but we need to get those people back into the labour market. They were there before, and we would benefit if they were there again.
Thanks, David. A question from James Cretney. It says, David, you have told us about strong employment, but today we are told that 40% of people using food banks are employed. Can you give us your views as to the potential peril or not of celebrating high employment, but forgetting much of that is low paid?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. One of the just puts the chart I showed you were for payroll employees, number of people on payroll, so employed. If you combine employment, the employed people and self-employed people, we are still below where we were before the pandemic struck. There's been a big fall of about 800,000 in the number of self-employed people in the UK, and some of that is to do with the older people I was mentioning who maybe were discouraged from staying self-employed by IR35 or something, or just if you were doing certain types of self-employment, maybe involved going into people's houses and so on, and it became too much of a bother during the pandemic. So self-employment has fallen quite a lot, but the low pay point is a very good one, and as you say, the number of people who are in work poverty is a serious problem for this country. The national living wage, the minimum wage, is going up by 6.6% next month. which I think helps. But and so does the change in the universal credit taper that Rishi Sunak announced in October. But we do have a problem. We have an unequal society. We have an unequal labour market, and this problem of I think we used to think that if you're in work, you're going to be okay. In work poverty is a serious problem, and you do well to raise the point, James. And it's one that I think the government's aware of. Whether they're doing enough about it is something we can debate.
Thanks, David. I'm just turning to unemployment. We've had a number of questions from people saying that if you roll back the clock, say 18 months ago, many economists, respected economists, were predicting that unemployment in this country would be, could be 10, 12, maybe even 15%. But it's actually, much lower than really anyone predicted. Can you quite believe where we are, David?
No, it is pretty astonishing. I think the reason why, that economists predicted, we had the biggest drop in GDP in 2020. Originally, it was the biggest drop since the Great Frost of 1709. And then it was revised up very slightly. So it became the biggest drop since 1921, the biggest drop in GDP for a century. And in those circumstances, nobody knew how well the furlough scheme was going to work, whether it was going to work at all. As I said earlier, the ambition of the Chancellor was to just provide a bridge from the pandemic through to normality. But he expected, and everybody else expected, unemployment to be somewhat higher than it was pre-pandemic for some time. So it was just much more effective. I mean, this was a new idea. It wasn't cheap, it cost 70 billion or so, but it worked incredibly effectively, and employers took to it, I don't think it was widely abused, by employers. I think some of the other aspects of pandemic assistance provided by the government probably were abused, and there've been certain elements of fraud in that. But the furlough scheme, I think, worked pretty well, worked better than the Treasury could have dreamed of. Even the people, I know the people who designed the furlough scheme in the Treasury, and they thought, if unemployment in the absence of it would have been, 10, 12%, as you were saying, if they could keep it down to 6 or 7%, they were doing a very good job. The fact it's much lower than that has beaten even their expectations.
Great, thank you, David. We've had quite a few questions come through about the forthcoming tax rises, I guess the freezing of the income tax bandings, national insurance and corporation tax. And one or two people suggesting that, I guess, sort of right-wing economic thinking, which I assume the Chancellor subscribes to, suggests that if you put taxes up, it suppresses the economy and ultimately reduces in tax receipts. So the fact he is putting taxes up suggests that maybe he's not as right-wing as he suggests he is, or he doesn't quite believe in right-wing economic philosophy. So we were keen to get your thoughts on that, David, if we may.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that he did there's a lecture that pretty much every modern chancellor has given called the Mays Lecture, MAIS, which is done at the City University in London, and he did his Mays Lecture last month. And one of the things I was very pleased to see him do was to sort of not knock down, but every Tory MP at some time or another says tax cuts pay for themselves, and this is based on this thing called the Laffer curve. Arthur Laffer, American economic professor, once drew on a napkin the Laffer curve, which showed that after a certain point, raising tax rates reduces revenue, and you might as well so by the same token, cutting tax rates can increase revenue. And he said quite clearly that although most of his speech was about how much of a Thatcherite tax cutter he instinctively was, nobody should get carried away with the idea that tax cuts are self-financing, because the fact is they're not. It's very difficult to find examples of tax cuts that are self-financing. And in terms of the kind of level, when does cutting income tax become self-financing? Well, the Treasury and HMRC just about managed to work out that cutting the top rate, the very top rate, the additional rate from 50 to 45% would not cost any lost revenue. It didn't bring any additional revenue, but it wouldn't cost any lost revenue. But you have to get up to those kind of levels of taxation, pretty high levels of tax rates, before any of those kind of latter effects start to come through. In general, they don't.
Thank you. David, we have lots of questions around cryptocurrencies. People asking your views on where they are, where they're going, and whether the situation of Russia, Ukraine, the pandemic has perhaps accelerated or decelerated their use. So it'd be good to get your thoughts and predictions on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, I mean, I come to this, from the point of view of being a bit of a cryptocurrency skeptic, but they are going to become mainstream. I mean, the central banks are now exploring setting up their own digital currencies, official digital currencies. The UK one has already been christened Britcoin, and so I think that's that is likely to happen. They may have been quite useful. I mean, as a store of value, would you want Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency, or would you want gold? And gold benefits, as it has done, from safe haven properties as a result of Russia, Ukraine. Some cryptocurrencies have done okay, some haven't. Some oligarchs have been probably using cryptocurrencies for getting their wealth away from the sanctions that has been imposed on them. So I'm still a cryptocurrency skeptic, but they are becoming more mainstream. I mean, the reason I'm a skeptic is because if you think back to the mysterious inventor of Bitcoin, he intended that this would be a kind of a medium of exchange that bypassed the conventional banking system, and not a speculative vehicle. And it is, most cryptocurrencies are speculative vehicles rather than mediums of exchange. We know how much energy mining these cryptocurrencies uses up. So they haven't fulfilled their original, if you like, mandate, but they are part of the scene, and they will remain part of the scene.
Great stuff. Thank you, David. We have quite a lot of questions around the national debt, which I think is now comfortably over £2 trillion, which people seem quite relaxed about. And again, really, I suppose keen to get your thoughts on, when it will start to come down, will it ever really come down? And one or two people have suggested on the chat box that maybe a bit of inflation is no bad thing because it starts to reduce it in real terms.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. Where have we been before on national debt? I mean, it's now, as you say, kind of 2.1 to 2.2 trillion, which is a lot of money, but it's just below 100% of GDP. And if you think about previous periods where we've had very high national debt, we at the end of the Second World War, the debt was 250% of GDP. It came down to 100%, roughly where it is now, by about 1963. So we're the highest since then. I suppose the difference is now that if you look at the future, we haven't got the kind of, at the end of the Second World War, you knew that demobilization was coming. We were going to adapt and move away from being a wartime economy to being a peacetime economy. So the route to a lower national debt was there. Now the pressures are in the opposite direction. That we've got demographic pressures on public spending. We've got all those things which will tend to push up public spending. The state pension, the public sector pensions, all those things will tend to push debt higher rather than lower. So, not so long ago, the OBR, the Office of Responsibility, put out some projections which were, what's going to happen to the national debt over the next 50, 60 years. And they were pretty scary. I mean, they were so scary, they had to attach a health warning, which was that we don't expect this to happen. We would expect the government to take action. But they had national debt rising to 300% of GDP in the 2060s. So that's true. On the point about inflation, that would be the case. But of course, about a fifth of the national debt is index linked. So inflation pushes up the cost of that index linked debt. It's not the panacea it used to be. I mean, it used to be the case that, as your questioners say, inflation was a great way to, well, inflating away the debt was a great thing to do. That's not the case anymore. It's more, it's on the one hand, on the other hand for that. And the index linked debt actually is a problem in terms of when you've got high and rising inflation.
Thank you, David. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Several people have written and asked about government spending, not just in this country, but across Europe. I think we've seen, obviously, Germany quite quickly with their new chancellor commit to spending more on defence. And people have been asking, does that mean that countries in Europe will continue to spend more on defence? And if so, will they spend less in other areas, perhaps health and education, or will they borrow even more to pay for that?
Yeah, it's a good one because, in essence, I mentioned what happened after the war. When we emerged from the Second World War, obviously defence spending was a huge proportion of GDP, a huge proportion of overall government spending. We had that peace dividend after the Second World War. We had another peace dividend after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and governments have used that to spend more on health, education, benefits, all those things, and it is the case. I mean, if Germany spends more, and we want to continue to be the second largest defence spender in NATO, we'll have to spend quite a bit more, about a quarter more than we do now. I think, and at the same time, committing to post-pandemic NHS recovery and all those things. So I think it is more likely to be out of additional borrowing than it is than cuts in health, education, and all those things. I don't think you can necessarily turn the clock back to where you were before. I mean, the NHS spending is about 6 times in real terms what it was in the 1950s. You can't take it back to accommodate much higher defence spending. I think we are going to see a higher borrowing, but one of the things I think we'll get next week is that the run of forecasts for borrowing and debt will be lower than was expected even a few months ago in October. So there is a bit of wiggle room there to allow for higher defence spending, which I think we will see higher defence spending.
Thank you, David. And we've got about 1 to 2 minutes left. So perhaps final question we've had submitted by an anonymous viewer. Marks out of 10 for Andrew Bailey, marks out of 10 for Rishi Sunak.
Andrew, I think, has had quite a tough time. I mean, his messaging has been problematical. I like him, but I think he's found it quite difficult to get simple messages across. So he has come across as a kind of Mr. Gradgrind, talking to everybody, asking everybody to restrain their pay demands and so on. And also the bank has got its communications badly wrong in terms of the timing of interest rate changes. That in November, everybody thought interest rates were going to go up. They didn't. Even he had sort of signaled that they probably would. So I think I'd give him pretty low marks. I think no better than 5 out of 10. I think I'd give Rishi much higher than that. I think he's very personable. I got to know him quite well, and it's not just because of that. I think he took over at a difficult time, just as the pandemic was breaking. I think he's done well. I think he obviously thinks about things very deeply. He works very hard, and he's the perfect chancellor to have, alongside someone like Boris Johnson, because you need somebody who really puts the hours in, does the work, knows the detail. His grasp of detail is incredibly good. So I'd give him, I'm not going to give him 10 out of 10, but I'll give him 8 or 9, I think.
He also brushes his hair and looks smart. So not that's the most important thing, but next to Boris Johnson, it stands out. David, the clock has beaten us. Thank you as always. You've spoken for us many, many times. So thank you as always for your time and wisdom and insight today. We all appreciate it. Thank you to all of you for dialing in. I hope you enjoyed the session. We will continue to run these virtually. We're obviously starting to do more of our events in person now. So I hope you'll see more of you face to face. Stay safe. Obviously, in these troubled times, our thoughts with the people of Ukraine, and we hope that situation gets resolved quickly for all of their sakes. Thank you for dialing in. Thank you again, David, and we'll see you all very soon. Goodbye.